I'm joined from Walthamstow in East London by the Labour MP Stella Creasy and from Westminster by Kate Andrews, author of the Gender Pay Gap Reporting Measures at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Stella Creasy, I'd like to begin with you.
Yeah.
You're part of this campaign. Why did you decide that you needed to start it?
Well, because it's one thing to have the data, which now companies have to give us by Wednesday of this week. All companies with over 250 employees, both in the public and the private sector, have to publish this data. But if we just have the data, we don't do anything with it, then what's the point? So we've set up this campaign for two reasons. First and foremost, because we've heard some worrying reports of when people have started talking about the data that has been published, being shut down in their workplace, being told that somehow if they raise these issues, it might affect their career. So we want to be very clear that people have a protected right to freedom of speech in the workplace, to raise these issues, to ask their employers what they're doing about them, to be part of a trade union, to be part of a women's network saying this isn't good enough, but also to gather people's experiences of what happens when they use this data so that we can then use that in Parliament. We want employers to know that we have the back of those people coming forward wanting to have this debate and that we will act if we see them being silenced.
OK, Kate Andrews, hashtag #PayMeToo. Are you going to be signing up?
I'm not. When the Me Too campaign first started, it was about women all over the world coming forward with their experiences of harassment and sexual assault. It was very serious, it was very meaningful, and it was organic. Hashtag #PayMeToo has taken the Me Too campaign and it's brought it into an area that is so deeply misleading. I've been on the website. There's very limited information, but what it does essentially is it masquerades as an equal pay website. Equal pay is mandatory in the UK. By law, men and women doing the same work have to be paid the same. But this campaign is trying to conflate equal pay with the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap comes down to a myriad of factors from job to age to experience, many of which have absolutely nothing to do with gender. And is trying to conflate the two, which I think at best is deeply misleading. And frankly, to piggyback on the Me Too campaign with this kind of misleading information is, I mean, the only way to paint it is that it's insulting.
Stella, what do you say to that? Deeply misleading and that you're just piggybacking off...
Sorry, Kate, your problem is the hashtag. My problem is that this data is showing us that, on average, women are paid 14% less than men in the organisations they work for. In fact, in some organisations, it's much bigger. We've got one example already of a hospital where for every 59p a woman earns, a man earns £1. That is a gender pay gap. That is absolutely right. It's something different to the equal pay legislation that we have in this country. But we need to deal with both, because what this data is telling us is that women are not being promoted, not being given the same opportunities, and as a result, we're all missing out. In Sky, for example, only a third of the top jobs are taken by women. That's now what this data tells us. Frankly, getting hung up on the hashtag rather than recognising what we're facing in this country, that doesn't sound like good economics to me, Kate.
I'm not hung up on any hashtag. I'm hung up on the fact that these new pay gap measurements are incredibly misleading and, frankly, useless. Only one of the 6 measurements has any real merit. None of them break down jobs, age, background, experience, time taken off work. You have not proven any kind of gender pay gap. What you have done is push many, many misleading statistics into the public domain, and it is absolutely an attempt to box women in to this victimhood mentality that, when you actually break down the data, if you look at the official data from the Office for National Statistics, does not exist. There is a reason that this new data does not line up with the official data, and that is because it is so badly calculated. If you are an economist, it doesn't matter which side of the debate you're on. This is just bad data.
No, Kate, you've just misquoted the Office of National Statistics. Kate, you've just misquoted the Office of National Statistics, which own studies show that, indeed, the gender pay gap amongst young women graduates and male graduates is growing. So, actually, equal pay and gender pay in this country
Stella,
is stagnating.
that is some ugly
but let's look at the data that we have in front of us. Well, we can ask the Office for National Statistics to confirm that, but that's what their data shows. You've asked about the data that the government is publishing.
-5.1.
One at a time. You have to just go one at a time.
Sorry.
Stella, you go ahead.
Look, OK, Kate, you want to talk about the data that's been published. I think a lot of women right now who are looking at data that shows that the bonuses that men in their company are getting are sometimes 50% more than them would disagree with you that that isn't meaningful information to know. I think a lot of women in companies and indeed in our public sector, for example, in the NHS where we're seeing a pay differential, despite the majority of the workforce being female, would find it insulting that you think that that is an interesting thing that we need to discuss. We need to understand why that is happening. This data is is the first step. The next step is to ask companies what they're doing about it. That's exactly what this research helps us to do. And
Stella,
for you to say that this data is misleading or unimportant, well, I have listened to UK, and I have listened to you insult the Office of National Statistics on their own research. So I think at the very least, you need to look at the data we're talking about today.
Stella, at the end of the day...
I disagree, and I think the numbers of women... It's actually about helping everyone, Kate, because the gender pay gap doesn't help anyone. What it also tells us is that still too often the idea about flexible work is something that women have to deal with rather than parents, for example. And what we're looking at for these companies, thankfully most of them take a very different view to you. They recognise it's a problem. If they're not tapping into the pool of talent they have in their companies because of the gender, they know they're missing out. What this data is doing is driving that conversation. What this campaign is doing is helping women and men be part of it.
Stella, the truth of the matter is that when you actually examine the measurements of this, you need so much more data in order to render anything meaningful from them. If you look at the bonuses that you just mentioned, it is impossible to know if men and women are being paid unfairly via bonuses unless you know what their actual salaries are. So you can know the percentage of their salary that's going towards a bonus, and so you actually have some meaningful data. We don't, Stella. The crude numbers that the government has mandated that companies report does not dive into any of this, and that makes it extremely misleading. Companies like EasyJet and Phase 8 are always going to have a wide gender pay gap, not because of discrimination, but because they do mass hiring of women into their primary and the majority of their roles, which happen to be in things like retail and cabin crew. Your government figures do not highlight that in any capacity, and now you have launched a campaign that directly tries to conflate the gender pay gap with equal pay. And if I may just finish, because I think you have had your time to speak, what this real attempt is here is to hit the reset button on equal pay. Women have been doing so well, and the stats prove it when you actually break down the data like for like, that the victimhood groups need to hit the reset button in order to keep their membership going. It works in elections, it works for things like the Equal Pay Day campaign, but women out there need to know just how misleading this data is, and I don't think your hashtag or your attempt to make companies report these misleading figures is helping them.
Okay. I'm dealing in facts, and the evidence that we have talks about the different quartiles. I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you that this data set is not complete. For example, I'd like to look also at the difference in terms of people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds, from disability backgrounds. But I'm just worried, Kate, the more and more I hear you talk and bandy around terms like victimhood, the more and more I don't think you're dealing in facts and actually what is being recorded at the moment. This data is driving a conversation because it does give the different pay quartiles in companies. That's how I know that Kimberly right now is working for an organisation where only a third of the people in the top jobs and the top pay quartiles are women, because that data is in the data set. I really suggest that it might be worth you go back and having a look at this data. I agree with Kate. I've listened to you, and I've been insulted by you. You've insulted the ONS. At the very least, don't insult Kimberly for the data being presented to her about her company.
I don't like your campaign.
You called it victimhood to talk about gender pay.
No, to conflate equal
come
pay
on,
and gender
Kate.
pay
This is the 21st century. Don't women
I think we're going to have to stop it there. Let's not talk about who's insulting who here. Let's talk about going forward. So, Kate, where do we go from here?
I think we absolutely need to roll back these pay gap measures because they haven't actually revealed anything meaningful. One area where I do think Stella and I might have some agreement is on things like shared parental leave, and it's a real shame that more men haven't taken that up. The only way to really tackle women getting into more senior roles is for more men to take time off work and to really split childcare. I mean, that would be a much more interesting campaign, especially because we know that so few men in the UK have taken up shared parental leave. But at the moment, what we're doing is we're demonizing actually many quite well-meaning companies, and we're really insulting women by suggesting to them that they're not doing as well as the actual official data shows. And when you break down these job comparisons like for like, when you look at age, when you look at experience, you get a very different picture. And it's really important that women sitting at home hear that, because it's just not what they're being told by MPs, by representatives, and by a modern-day feminist movement that doesn't have their best interest at heart.
OK, Stella Creasy, where do you think we should go from here?
Yeah, and back in the real world, where women do recognise in their workplaces they still face discrimination, where this data is helping to drive a conversation about what happens next. Maybe one of the things that we need to do is to tackle those tired old gender stereotypes that somehow suggest that retail is for women, or that companies like EasyJet, where there are pilots, that women can't fly planes. Maybe one of the things that we actually need to do is ask employers why their top jobs aren't open to women, which is what this data will help us start that conversation to do. It's also about making sure this conversation isn't shut down by people talking about victimhood or somehow that modern feminism is failing women. Feminism isn't about women, it's about power. It's about the power to see that 51% of our community doesn't get the same chance as the other 49% because of their gender. This data is part of that conversation. It's not the only conversation. I know from actually working in the communities and working in the real world, that's a conversation we need to have.
Lots of us talk to
Okay,
women,
Stella Creasy, Kate Andrews, thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us.
Speaking of annoyances, we want to get your thoughts on this gentleman. A relationship expert called Deanne Carson has come out overnight and said parents should ask their babies for permission before they change their nappies. Have a listen to this first.
Oh, God, next subject.
I'm going to change your nappy now. Is that okay? Of course, the baby's not going to respond, yes, Mum, that's awesome. I'd love to have my nappy changed. But if you leave a space and wait for body language and wait to make eye contact, then you're letting that child know that their response matters.
Oh, God. Oh, God.
Jeff.
Next subject.
No, Jeff, seriously
Well,
here.
I tell you what, this is a subject on which Mark is much better qualified to
Yes,
answer.
expert.
Mark, what
Over
would
to
you
you.
like to say about this lady?
Well, it's the equivalent of talking to yourself. Because having changed hundreds of nappies in my time, the baby never answers back.
No.
And I'm afraid the young lady there talking to herself should be locked up. This is certifiable insanity. Just change the baby's nappy. The baby's got poo and wee in the nappy. Help your kid instead of this delusion that somehow the 3-month-old infant is going to talk back. It is cuckoo.
There is the voice of honesty and the truth.
I cannot
Total.
believe you two agree on something. Ring the bell. All right.
Quite a lot there this morning.
Thank you two. We'll talk to you from London next week, hopefully.